Most buyers never tell you where you lost them. They sit through your demo, read your proposal, take your follow-up call, and then they go quiet. And somewhere in your sales process, that deal gets marked as lost to a competitor or no decision. But the truth is usually simpler, and it's harder to hear. The process broke down somewhere, and nobody on your team saw it coming, because your buyers have a seat at every meeting you will never be invited to. The outside seat sits in that seat. I'm Mike Tumulty, founder of Inside Now, where we go through your commercial funnel as a real buyer and tell you exactly what we find. I'm also the host of the Outside Seat podcast, where I bring that conversation to the people who can actually do something about it. Every week, two strands. The GTM leaders talking strategy, and then the unsung heroes talking reality. Brought to you by Flourish, the GTM talent partner that connects hiring, development, and performance in sales, in life. Now to today's show. Welcome to this week's episode of The Outside Seat. I'm thrilled to have Daniel Gray with us here today. Where we mutually meet, we've both worked in localization. So I was at Localize for a little period of time, and Daniel will talk a little bit about his career to date, an extensive history of working within the localization industry. And we'll also get into some other details about Daniel's perspective on the sales industry, and more specifically about the outside seat and how buyers engage within the localization industry and beyond. Localization is one of the most buyer-facing commercial functions in technology. When it works, nobody notices, but when it fails, everybody does. This conversation is about what it takes to build a GTM motion that never lets the buyer feel that friction. So rather than me getting into any more detail, Daniel, why don't you give 2 minutes around who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. My name's Daniel. I've been in the localization space, like you've said, for about 25 years. I currently lead the go-to-market function for Acolad, which is a top firm in the industry. And Acolad is a great organization. We offer localization services, enablement, and technology across translation, interpretation, multimedia, data services. So it's a full breadth organization. And I'm just delighted to be in this conversation and talk a little bit more about go-to-market, all things go-to-market.
Awesome. So like you said, you lead the GTM for North America with Acolad. The buyer for localization services is often its product, its engineering or content, rather than your typical commercial one, I suppose, if that's the right terminology. What does that mean for how you build and run a GTM motion? And how do you ensure that the entire team stays anchored to what the buyer actually experiences?
Yeah. Today, Mike, more than ever, from our past in this space, but it's moved to a very high-tech or technology forward conversation, engagement, evaluation. So regardless of what service or capability we're offering, the conversation is starting with and anchored to the technology architecture, the infrastructure, the workflow. So our conversation or engagement with customers is that much more forward deployed sales and sales engineering than I've ever seen it before. It's super exciting, especially the enablement of AI across all of those capabilities, but it tends to be extremely anchored these days, more in tech than anything else.
Yeah. And how's that changed over, say, the last 2-3 years? Obviously, with AI taking more of a leading role within this industry, how does that change how you go about selling?
Yeah. I think that in the past, it was very services forward. So it was more about the human in the loop carrying the 60, 70, 80+% of the workload. Today, that's literally flipped. And I'm sure it's the case regardless of your localization or other use cases or workloads. It's flipped to the human is handling the scarcity element, right? The QC, the QA, the validation, the human in the loop. And so the conversation tends to be around the workflows, the engines and the technology that you're using in the deployment of AI, the accuracy, um, reliability, compliance, all those buzzwords. But those have become critical because again, the technology in the machine is doing so much more of the heavy lifting these days, and the automation. One of the buzzwords that maybe you had during your time as well is touchless translation or autonomous translation. So I think this is a really exciting part of where we are at the inflection point of the industry. But that's where the conversation is gravitating to.
Yeah. Before this conversation, I read an article that you wrote around pricing strategies. So let's just throw this one at you from left field a little bit. How has that evolved for you over the last 2, 3, 4 years when thinking about pricing for customers in this industry today versus 2, 3 years ago? Like you said, it's more technology led than services and human in the loop. But how do you think about that from a pricing strategy perspective?
Uh, Possibly getting into some of the speeds and the feeds in our space, but again, the concept may be universal. You've got the technology or infrastructure costs associated with the deployment of your solution. You've also got the consumption side of your solution. On the consumption side, we now have multiple service levels at our disposal, which you can pair with content categories, languages, product mission criticality. So now you've got anything from raw machine translation to get into some of the speeds and feeds that is actually improving in its quality output, to machine translation with post editing, to AI with human in the loop, and AI only. So you have these different, this stratification of service levels, which you work backwards from a customer's, again, product, language, mission criticality, et cetera. And you compare the service level at the consumption cost. You compare the service level with what the customer is looking to accomplish, right, in terms of quality that they need to release to market. On the infrastructure side, that's actually also quite interesting because at this point, all the services that we offer come bundled with some type of tech, be it interpretations or translation. There's a huge component, right, to the technology. So we are constantly looking at, right, the two, I'm speaking simply, but the two elements of driving the total cost of ownership for the customer. And that's massively different than back in the day where you're looking at human labor costs only. So now we've got an element of tech in the mix.
And from your perspective, looking at how customers think about engaging in this industry, localization specifically, there's been a lot of change. Like you said, human in the loop, services, and tech. How has the customer base moved through that journey with you? Are you leading them there, or are you either playing catch up with them, or are you side by side going through this journey together?
I'll share, although I can't share the customer name, I'll share one of the more recent, highly complex opportunities that we collaborated on. It was a highly competitive environment. And to the spirit of your question, what was absolutely clear was that the technical team, we're talking the dev and the CTO, the office of the CTO on the customer side, was part and parcel of the evaluation, highly technical evaluation. It demanded that from the office of our CTO through to forward deployed engineering, and that applies in our industry today. That was critical because in the space of AI and our ability to custom or co-develop with our customers, um, you're hand in hand with the engineering team and the dev and the technology team on the customer side as much as you are with the team on our side. So that's just compressed, right? That aperture has closed, and the proximity between those two teams, there's a lot more involvement, and it's less, right? That team is sitting in the back office and you've got the sales team out front. So I actually think it's fascinating. It's been exciting, but this particular opportunity really pronounced how much that's coming to the forefront.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. So, localization is one of those categories where the buyer's problem is often invisible, as I said in the introduction, until something really goes wrong. A product launches in the wrong language, a legal document's mistranslated, a brand message lands badly in a new market because how you said Turkey versus one country versus another can be misinterpreted. How do you build urgency and relevance in a commercial conversation before that crisis actually happens for the customer?
One of the things, whether or not we're responding to an RFP or if we're trying to engage a customer, right, to not necessarily create the urgency, but align on the business case. But I think that one of the most important parts of our go-to-market motion is building and aligning on that business case with the customer. And probably similar to your experience, your background in the space, there are a lot of stakeholders in an enterprise sales cycle. And regardless of if we are engaging in data services where we're training, millions of data points, if we're doing interpretation, we're doing translation, it really doesn't much matter the line of business that the customer is looking to deploy or the solution the customer is looking to deploy. But what has become critical is aligning on that business case. And I don't know that that's much different than the days of old, but I think it becomes even more pronounced in today's world because the movement, the shifting, the definition of AI and what customers are trying to extract, the business results they're trying to accomplish, right? There's all the cool bells and whistles of AI by itself, but then there's the ROI of AI. So that business case for me is mission critical. It's kind of the foundation, right, of your sequence of events or your mutual action plan with the customer. I think that's probably one of the most important elements, especially today.
What's new in the industry specifically around the stakeholders? Are there different people that you're having to engage in the process now than you were 3 years ago? So, like we said before, there's your engineering, there's products, there's content, but now with AI as part of that mix, are the different stakeholders that you're having to bring in? So those that not necessarily are a tick in the box, but they have the power of no. So they could be somebody that would say no. Is that different these days?
You know, it it is a little bit different. And if I go back to some of the bigger, more complex enterprise deals, just to give you a sense, and we can talk about different ends of the spectrum, but on the much larger complex deals, and again, regardless of it's translation or interpretation, as well as data services, we are finding more stakeholdership and interest at higher levels, which I think is exciting, right? So be it the CFO or the CTO, I mean, it is getting up to that level. I think one of the things that we shared prior to kicking off the conversation is localization is probably one of the ripest use cases for AI. Right? And as such, it garners a lot of attention, not just because it drives a lot of revenue, not just because it's a major expense line for companies that are deriving 30, 40, 50+% of total revenues outside the United States or from non-English releases, but it is garnering more attention because of that AI element and the technology involved and how it touches so many different parts of the business. I think it's garnering more attention and involvement than it used to, which was, back in the day, a little bit more of an afterthought. But I think AI is putting us in an interesting spotlight. It's challenging, but it's also giving us that grander exposure.
Interesting. It brings to the mind another question, which is how do we set up for our GTM teams for this particular modern world? If we look at the hiring profiles that you have, has that changed over the last 2, 3 years as well when more AI is introduced, or is the profile of the team that you're trying to design, trying to build internally, is that evolving as well, the skill set?
What a great question. Absolutely. Yes. Now, what's interesting is because you and I are cut from the cloth of localization, there are still some fundamentals from the past that I think are important to understand. There's the nuances and the culture of the industry and the culture of the buyer, right? It's kind of the sell to the middle to sell to the top. You still have that, whereas in other industries, you might have more of a sell from the top down. So there's that skill set or nuance to the type of rep that is successful in the space. The other part, Mike, is the technology forward or the technology minded and forward sales rep. When you go back to the business case that I was talking about, it's not just how do you get English to target language, right? There's the whole element of tech and the infrastructure, the tech stack, the architecture, the workflows, um, compliance, all that is really, really important. So I think the difference, to answer the spirit of your question, is you do need reps that are more comfortable talking about the tech. You need reps that are also able to translate the tech and the service into the business results, right? That value creation that we deliver for customers. So that's the big difference that I've seen. And what I've seen some of the providers in our space do is go and hire from SaaS or traditional SaaS and then train into the localization space. Because to be fair, and it's the case at Acolad, we have a multi-stack environment. I have lots more products today, technology products, that we offer to market. So the sales cycle, the sales process, as you were mentioning before, that too has changed because it's a product forward sales, whereas what we used to do was a services forward sale. So those skill sets, the combination of those skill sets, that is, I think, what is demanding the type of ideal rep that we're looking for.
That's really interesting. So if, obviously you're leading within North America, and localization is inherently global in nature. So how do you manage the tension between a consistent commercial motion and the reality that buyers in different markets experience your product and your sales process may be differently?
Yeah, for sure. So, to give you a sense, at Acolad, we are comprised of 11 or 12 different scopes. I'm but one of those scopes. And within the scope that I have the honor of leading, we have the United States and we have our Canadian team. The Canadian team is mighty. In fact, they've had some really great successes this year. But the way that you outbound in Canada and the way that you can interact with the market is actually, there are nuances and there are differences and there are regulations as compared to the United States. So even though our two teams operate very closely, we understand that we have to change the go-to-market motion ever so slightly, localize the go-to-market motion, right? And I'm speaking only for the North American team, but to your point, I also interact with and collaborate with the heads of sales for all the other scopes, and there are very clear, right, micro adjustments, sometimes macro adjustments that need to be made. But to give you that example, in my scope, Canada versus United States, just there alone, there are differences in the go-to-market motion.
That's interesting. Do you have a specific example? So you talked there about outbound is slightly different, just for the audience, because this is going out across Europe and in the North America. What are those differences? You said that there are differences, but what are they?
Yeah. So just even outbounding an email, the types of tools that you use in the stack, the team in Canada has to follow certain regulations uh, in terms of being able to reach out to prospects, right? So they have challenges that we don't necessarily have in the United States. And even then, um, you've probably experienced, and many people have reported, right, that email response rates are a lot different than they used to be back in the day. So social selling is something that we're doing a lot of, and events is still part of that. Micro events that are very targeted, smaller in nature, but a lot more curated and personal. We're finding those type of events to deliver a better experience for the customer and better results for us. But those are some of the differences. They're small, but they dictate how the team in Canada can outbound versus how the team in the United States outbounds, and what's effective and what's not effective.
Awesome. And when you talk about social selling, is that something that you brought in when you joined Accolade nearly 3 years ago, or is this something that's been there ever present? You've just honed and built upon it?
Yeah. Actually, our CRO, Grania, has had a series with LinkedIn, and she herself is fantastic in the market. She's been in the industry a long time. So she's quite active. I think, a point that you make that's quite interesting is social selling really does start from the top or includes the top. I think that's really important because you're really just you're interacting with and speaking to the market. Another thing that our reps are doing is, rather than trying to get into somebody's DM and affect the sale, is to share and create information, or rather value, well before. Because probably like you and I, we're doing a lot of research. We use AI to do research. I follow a lot of people in LinkedIn, and I learn a lot from them before I might ever take an action. So I think that's part of what we are finding is effective. It's a little bit longer, but as you seed the field, right, you're creating customer trust. I think that that's paramount.
Now, before we continue, a word from today's sponsor, Flourish. Most businesses don't underperform because they can't hire or don't invest in training. They underperform because the two things never talk to each other. Hiring happens over here, development happens over there, and somewhere in the middle, invariably performance breaks down. Flourish fixes that. They're an award-winning go-to-market talent partner working across early career SDR hiring, senior sales talent, and practical training that drives real, measurable results and not just activity. I've personally worked with their managing director, Sarah Skelton, for almost 20 years, so I know how they operate. They stay invested through the full journey and not just the placement. If you're looking to build a commercial team that actually performs, Flourish is where I would start. Find them at helloflourish.com. In sales, in life. Yeah, awesome. When we talk about the profile, and we talked about that a few minutes ago around the change of profile of seller within that space, and you talked about maybe taking people from SaaS into the localization industry. I was one of those. Hands up. I was that guy. I've been in SaaS for 15 years, technology for 25 years in total. Had very little localization experience. I knew localization, I knew the benefits of localization, but didn't really have that level of experience. So the one thing that I tried to do initially was go and interview as many customers as possible, maybe 2, 3, 4 a week, that I could then learn from them around what their challenges are, what their pains are. And some of those were on site. So I'd go on site to maybe Ford, or I would have video conferences with people in California all the way down to Australia, and just trying to absorb as much information from the industry as possible. What's that lesson that maybe somebody new coming into into the localization industry from that SaaS background, what's that one or two or three things that you think that they should really get a grip of quickly? Because it is a technical sale, um, but I'm also a believer that you can learn the technology side. But what are those one or two things that they really need to understand about the industry?
Yeah. Uh, I'll try this out. Maybe you can tell me because you've got that experience. But um, I think one of the biggest challenges for a sales executive coming from outside the industry in is, to your point, is learning not just the ICP, but the buying persona and the importance of the user buyer to the overall decision. I remember when I was at Amazon, actually, as a bit of a comparable, we were selling to data scientists, data researchers. These were folks that had their fingernails dirty. They were using the product, and their first time experience was generally in some type of simple test or pilot. But from that test or pilot, they would go to API. From API, they would go to scale. But I think that, the user buyer, which you probably remember, is the program manager and can be the linguist and can be, folks that they're not carrying a C title or a VP title, but they do carry a lot of importance. And again, localization, interpretation, data services, it's ubiquitous. We are talking to the middle that's going to use the service once, the whole sales process is done or the buying evaluation is done. So I think that's one of the most important things. And we learned that having been in the industry for a long time. But I think as people come from the outside, and I don't know if that resonates with your
It,
experience.
it re- really resonates strongly, and I think one thing that I noticed in my tenure within localization is the community is really, really strong. The community of people within that localization industry, whether they're localization managers or the other profiles that you just mentioned, that community is very, very tight. They all speak to each other, they all learn from each other. they all engage with the different vendors, the different partners. Um, and I found that was really, really interesting because they were very the customers that I spoke to, they were very open. They would share their challenges, they would share their issues, they would share the great things about the technology and the vendor that we were, but they'd also be quite open around, "But if you could just fix this for me, if you could just do that for me, that would make my world so much easier." And then you'd work and you try and make that happen for them. But then they would share it as well. They would share that good news. So I thought I found that really, really interesting for this particular industry, that it was just so there's a lot of camaraderie, even with people you might think are competitors. In any other industry, you might say, "No, you can't put that person with that person on the same dinner table." But I saw it in action. They were just sat down and they were just chatting and they were sharing war stories about, "This is how we do it, and this is how we do it, and this is if you did this, if you thought about," and I just thought that was really, really interesting.
You know, it may not be evident on the surface, but because my family is from Brazil, I'm half Brazilian. I speak fluent Portuguese, and I started in this industry actually in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. But I think you touch on a point that's so key about our industry, which is the mission and the passion. And it's almost like World Cup, which is happening right now. Everybody loves soccer, and you can actually, you can have your competitiveness, but at the end of the day, it's the beautiful game, and everybody is so passionate about what our mission is, which is language enablement, language accessibility, right? Inclusion, all those good words. And you're absolutely right. And that's one thing that I've always loved about the 25 years that I spent in this space. The one thing that binds us all together is a passion for the mission, what that ultimately does for the company, for the product, for the customer. But there is that unification across competitive lines, and the industry events are always that same way. But I think
Yeah.
that's the nucleus of it all is right the passion for the mission.
But what does that gap look like from where you sit? And what, if anything, have you done to help close that within your within your company?
Two things come to mind at a recent event that I was at. Um, and these were folks from the buyer side, from the customer side, that were talking about the transformation of what was the localization team at the customer side turning into the international customer experience team, because the process of localization, albeit the same, just more technology machine and maybe the human being reshuffled on the assembly line, so to speak. But the reality is, and folks like Anna Schlegel that you may know, she's lobbied for this for a very long time, is how do you continue to lift, and Renato Beninato as well, how do you continue to lift the value and where localization's seat at the table is because of just how mission critical it is to uh, total revenue, uh, customer experience, and so on and so forth. So that's one element. I think that going back to previous point that we talked about, the involvement of technology and what AI is ushering in and the velocity that it's ushering in. I think again to some of the more recent engagements that we've had, and it's it's a massive investment on behalf of the organization. They are trying to reduce that cost vis-a-vis AI, but procurement is involved and compliance is involved and legal is involved and tech is involved. That's still the same from days of old. But I think what is making the difference is the systems that are now touching localization is becoming more automated and more connected, that those stakeholders, right, are broader. So I go back to the business case. I go back to helping a customer through their own buying journey and process of evaluation. And some of the nuances that I think helps Acolad help customers is the business case and helping to construct an evaluation roadmap that aligns all the stakeholders. And as I mentioned before, the stakeholders are coming from different levels, high and wide, on our customer side. And it's just so critical that we help them in that buying journey, because at the end of the day, that technology that we're deploying is probably going to be connected to multiple systems, and at some point is going to be relatively autonomous. Um, so that's the reason that those things are so critical to our go-to-market motion.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think one of the things that I noticed towards the end of my tenure was there was a lot of cost savings or a lot of cost pressure, should we say, within the industry because of the introduction of AI. The natural instincts for a lot of CFOs was, well, we don't need this many translators. We can use AI. But then there was still that human in the loop element. I'm out of the industry for a year now, give or take. How has that changed in the last 12 months, if at all?
What a great question. And that's really important. There's a book called Reshuffle, which I've read, which was a recommendation from Renato Beninato. A fantastic book in terms of helping us think through the framework of AI. So the easiest way to think about it is if you take the algorithmic line, right, as if it were the equator, above the algorithm is the likes of human in the loop, meaning that you've got enterprise grade complexity, volume, lots of languages, high velocity, potentially lots of products and content categories. So that huge mix is above that algorithmic line and requires that human in the loop element to get that high quality out to market. Now, below the algorithmic line or below the algo are the somewhat self-service autonomous products. And Acolad has a product like that, and so many of our competitors have developed effectively a self-service project, which would be no different than going into a Google Translate, right? It's below the algorithmic line. You don't have or really need a human in the loop to get the gist or the quality, the basic quality out. I think that's the big difference, Mike, is that above and below the algo, which is a concept out of that book Reshuffle, which helped me wrap my arms around the complexity. And that's why there are these different product offerings that are placed there. So we can have customers that can deploy for us Leo Go, which is an autonomous, effectively Google Translate type product, except it's very specific to them. It's LLM based, et cetera. And then you've got the more enterprise grade product above. The same thing is happening with voice. So we have a product that can sit below that algorithmic line. And then you have the product where you've got AI and potentially a spillover to human if and when the interp session doesn't work out. So there's all kinds of applications, but this above and below the algo is a very interesting way to think about it.
We have a tradition on this episode, on this podcast, where we do the rapid fire questions and we ask everybody the same questions. So if you're cool, we'll get into that.
Let's do it.
What's the one tool in your GTM stack that you just simply cannot live without?
Well, I am guilty of being become addicted to Gemini, and we are now working ourselves into Claude, but it's been revolutionary for me.
It's amazing. Like I said before this episode started, I've done 11 episodes so far of the podcast, and the amount of times that people are saying Gemini, Claude, ChatGPT, rather than it's Gong or it's Salesforce or it's your traditional tools that were really important from a GTM stack perspective. It's like, no, it's my AI agents that I've set up in Claude. That's what's really important to me now.
It might
It's
be
really interesting.
it might be the shiny object. I mean, at the at the base of the stack is Salesforce still, and of course, some of the others, as you mentioned, some of the names. But to share something that is cutting edge, and it's there's different levels of AI literacy, etc. But yeah, for me, it's Gemini is pretty amazing.
Awesome. The biggest GTM myth that you would like to kill off?
Yeah, I'm a huge student of revenue architecture is one of my favorite books, and um, the math, the science, and the architecture of revenue and sales. For me, the science is the most intriguing part. Um, there's still art. I think that there's still art in the human to human interaction, and it's still extremely important and valuable. But if there's one thing that I love about sales is the architecture and setting up that machine.
No, you're a man after my own heart. Um, the metric you look at first thing on a Monday morning?
Uh, well, uh, revenue, revenue is nearly keen all the time. But if there's something that I'm looking at from a sales perspective, sales uh, performance perspective, sales velocity is one of my favorite KPIs. Not the only one I look at an abundance of KPIs, but sales velocity is one of my favorite.
You've mentioned a couple of books during the main episode, but what's the GTM or self-help book that you always go back to, and why? I think as somebody looking at your profile, you you're clearly a writer yourself. You like to write, you like to write articles, you've engaged in ebooks. What's that one book that you always go back to?
Yeah. I'll give you two. I'll give you a bonus. Believe it or not, the presentation secrets of Steve Jobs was a game changer for me. That was already a long time ago. But to your point, there's the tech enabled or tech powered book by Justin Michael. I participated in that book, but it is a great book, and he's got a whole series of books actually that are quite interesting. I've got a library full of books, but those are two that jump to mind.
Awesome. And who's the most underrated person in your professional network that more people should really know about?
This is what one of my favorite questions. There are two gentlemen that I'm currently working with that I would love to call out. Joe Bayert, who's on our development team, and he was part of one of the one of the opportunities or deals that we talked about earlier today. And Stefan Singuino, who is our CTO. And the reason I'm sharing these, there's lots of fantastic people in my network, both here at Acolad and beyond. But to the spirit of our conversation, I nearly cannot engage in serving customers without the tech team anymore. And so I've come to work closely with these guys. So those are the two that I would.
Yeah, isn't it incredible when you are paired up with a CTO who is not only phenomenal at their job, not only is a good advocate internally for the company and the solution, but is also customer centric, can get in front of customers, can talk the talk in front of a customer. At Localize, they've got a phenomenal CTO in Magnus. So I've got a lot of respect for him. And it's a breath of fresh air when you have somebody as a revenue leader to have a CTO that you can. I don't have to worry about that. It is they know what they're doing and they're going to give us the tools to be able to do the job. So shout out to Stefan. It's a thankless job. Is there anything that we've not covered today? I'm sure there's probably plenty that you thought, I really wish I got this point across, or I really wish we'd attacked this particular topic.
I'll leave you with one. It's part of what I'm doing most of my research on now. Are you talked about the tech stack, the go-to-market tech stack, and that stack is changing so quickly. There's one shout out that I would give is to the team at Swan AI. I've been watching them from the sidelines. It's a very interesting group, very impressive CEO, and their new VP of sales. Um, the instrumentation of the AI powered go to market team, I think, is something that is front and center for all sales leaders, regardless of what role they play in the go to market team. It certainly is for me. So I'm watching groups like that that are effectively trying to become, if not already, autonomous go to market teams where they are really instrumenting and building from the ground up with AI, which is different than trying to bolt AI onto your current go-to-market engine. So that's one that I thought, yeah, that's an interesting one to mention.
No, thanks for sharing, because I think from time to time, and I'll say this to anybody that's listening today, sometimes it's difficult to see the wood for the trees. There are so many AI startups, pop-ups, scale-ups that are coming into the market who are pivoting once they've gone through the startup phase. Now we're pivoting because we've found actually we're better at this. So to get those recommendations for people that are actually watching those companies, I think it's really important that we all learn from each other. When we talked before about community, I think GTM leaders also have a responsibility to share with other GTM leaders what is actually happening, what's going to help them within their day to day. So I will take a look at that myself. I will then put a link to it in the description. Just give them a little bit of love as well. So thanks for sharing that. And Daniel, I really appreciate you taking the time today. This is a really, really good episode for those people that are within the localization industry or thinking about going into the localization industry. They should really pay attention to you and what you're doing within Acolad over in the US. So I really appreciate you taking the time. And until next time on the outside seat. Your buyers are still sitting in that outside seat. Subscribe on YouTube, follow on Apple or Spotify, drop a like and a follow. It genuinely means the world as we keep growing this channel. And if today's conversation sparked a question or a thought, leave it in the comments. Every month I answer your questions in a dedicated episode, and the best ones might just end up on Instagram, LinkedIn or TikTok. Your question could be the next conversation that we have. This episode was brought to you by Flourish. Find them at helloflourish.com. We will see you next time with a brand new guest in the outside seat.